Good morning, everyone. I'm going to apologise straight away for my sniffly, stupid face. I'm ill, basically, because my students are trying to kill me off. Although I have got a pretty good radio voice right now. So today's video is us going to be going through self-reports. It shouldn't be too long. It's a relatively straightforward part of research methods. We are looking at self-reports, which is basically questionnaires and interviews. Self-reports are basically when a participant will self-report on things they are feeling or their thought processes or, their emotions. It's pretty integral part of research. Worth noting that self-reports can be done as an independent research methods, as in you can just do an interview to find out information, or more typically, self-reports are actually used as part, like within an experiment or as part of an observation, for example. That's called triangulation of method, but more on that later. This is an example of a self-report. It is a 6-question questionnaire. It's one I used actually in my dissertation. It's relatively straightforward. It's called It's called the Brief Resilience Scale. It's a measure, fairly crude, I guess, that tries to measure how much resilience you have. Now, remember, you need to know the validity and the reliability of these sorts of things. Is this accurate, as in valid? Does it accurately measure validity? Well, not necessarily. People can lie. People may misinterpret some of these questions. Is it reliable? Is it consistent? If I measure you as resilient now with a score of 4.1, if I give it to you tomorrow, could you be 1.4? So you do need to ascertain the validity and the reliability, but this is an example of self-reports. This is a questionnaire. You can also have interviews, so you need to know all of this. But it's basically research methods in which participants give information about themselves, typically without research interference. You need to know the types of questions. You need to know that the types of interviews and questionnaires and stuff. I will apologise because these slides are not my greatest slides. They're on my list of stuff to improve. But participants are asked to make subjective judgments. Now, typically speaking, this is actually a really important point that goes underneath the radar. Self-reports tend to gather subjective data, right? They very rarely collect objective, factual data. If the participant is answering a question, or if the participant is, filling out the questionnaire or something, they tend to be giving their opinion. So there's huge validity issues with this. There's huge validity issues. The participant could find out what the study is about. That's demand characteristics. That leads to social desirability bias, which in turn lowers the validity of these research methods. Interviews are quite common. They are typically tend to be used. Questionnaires are also quite common as well. But as I've said, as with observations, self-report is a method in its own right. And some people just do self-reports, right? Nothing else. Some people just do self-reports, but most of the time they're incorporated into an experiment, as part of an experiment. So let's have a little bit of a look at interviews and questionnaires. The 3 types of questions you have, you probably know 2 of them already, open and closed. First one is open questions. Now, questionnaires and interviews give open questions. They require detail, elaboration, or explanation. One thing I would link to this is they typically tend to produce qualitative data. And also open questions are quite good at explaining why a behavior happens. Not what behavior happens, not necessarily, not even how it happens, but open questions producing qualitative data can answer the question as to why behavior happens, which is what you would consider to be the more important question. Closed questions, you know closed questions, to be perfectly honest with you, they will present participants with a limited number of responses. Now, it's really, really important to know, if you don't give the predetermined responses, it technically isn't a closed question. So, for example, if I were to say, do you like football? Yes, no, that's a closed question. But if I were to say, do you like football? That typically is not a closed question. You have to give the participants a limited number of responses for it to be a closed question. Closed questions don't really tell us why a behavior happens. They typically tend to tell us what behavior happens. And then lastly, you have Likert or rating scales. Likert or rating scales are typically a number-based scale where you rate or rank your opinion in something. So, how much do you like football on a scale of 1 to 7? Strongly like is 1 and strongly dislike is 7. Now, a piece of advice, always give the criteria of what the end is, right? If that makes sense. Always give what is 1, what is 7, what is 1, what is 5, what is 1, what is 6. With Likert scales, you do need to know the benefit, I guess, of doing a 7-point scale compared to a 6-point scale, or vice versa. So, for example, in a 7-point scale, you have a middle option, 4 in this case. From a scale of 1 to 7, 4 is in the middle. So you have no opinion on something, or you don't like or dislike it. What some researchers do is they'll force you into an answer. So they get on a scale of 1 to 6. So you either have to say you slightly like or you slightly dislike. So there are pros and cons to both, and you kind of need to know them. As it says, a self-report is only ever as good as the question it contains. How do you know your questions actually measure what it is you think what you think they are measuring? And that's why you do a pilot study. So a pilot study is a trial run through of your questionnaire or interview to see if there's any problems, to see if your participants actually understand what it is they're answering, to give you a clue about how long the questionnaire and interview is going to take. So I've just realised, and this is really irritating me, I don't think the first letter of those are in bold, whereas the rest are. These aren't my slides, these are quite old, but what monster would do that? So a self-report tries to eliminate this problem, tries to eliminate questions being misinterpreted for what they are actually saying. You do need to know strengths and weaknesses, and I'm not really going to go through them with you. You can pause it here because they're pretty easy, to be honest. They're pretty straightforward. Such strengths of generally, by the way, these are self-report as a whole. They tend to produce numerical data, particularly with closed questions. They can produce large quantities quite quickly. The interviewing can be quite time-consuming. It is incredibly subjective, which means what's a consequence of that? If it's subjective, it's not particularly scientific, because how do you know people giving their opinions actually their opinion? It's not factual. So you need to know the strengths and weaknesses. You do also have to know the strengths and weaknesses of questionnaires and interviews in particular. But in terms of how you elaborate on it, this is kind of what I would like you trying to do. This is a model peel for a self-report. In this case, I'm criticizing questionnaires. I don't think you're going to have to do this every year, but write a full peel. Usually, if you're asked to evaluate questionnaires, it's like 2 or 3 marks, but this would absolutely get full marks. Right, so questionnaires may be criticised for the participant giving the answer that the researcher wants. Short and sharp, right? That's a good point. What's your evidence here, for example, right? So maybe a little more elaboration, but if a researcher gave participants a scale which probed the motivation and the happiness, participants may deduce the link between the two as being investigated, and therefore they're going to change their answers, and therefore it's not going to be valid, so on and so forth. So That would be how you go about answering that question. That's how you elaborate. That's how you structure that point, and that would certainly get you full marks. So there is an example exercise just here that I think would be quite good. So in this case, questionnaires can be criticized for the tendency to ask questions that may be interpreted in multiple ways. What's your evidence here? Maybe use the brief resilience scale I showed you at the start. Maybe use one of those questions as evidence to say, well, this could clearly be interpreted in multiple ways. For example, if I just show you the first question, I tend to bounce back quickly after hard times. What is hard times? Some people's hard times are incredibly harder than some other people's. So that's quite easy to misinterpret. That's fair. Some people's hard time is getting a U in an exam. Other people's hard time is, remember their family dying. They're not the same. They are absolutely not the same. So your ability to be able to interpret this question, I think, is quite important, really. It's saying offline, so I'm hoping it's not shut off my I'm going to be pissed. I'm going to be pissed. But it says it is continuing. Anyway, we'll move on. If we can make sure we are working, please. Okay, there we are working. So there's a little bit more evaluation here. Fine. There's a little bit more evaluation in terms of interviews. Again, you need to know all this, but it's relatively straightforward, to be perfectly honest with you. Now, where it gets harder is understanding the validity and the reliability of self-report, and even the ethics. Reliability is about consistency. In self-reports, do you get consistent findings? You have to argue yes or no. Now, personally, I would say if I give you a questionnaire about your resilience today, and I give you one in, say, 2 weeks, I think they're going to be different. Because bear with me, would I not also be measuring your mood a little bit? If you're in a bad mood or something and you feel maybe a bit shit or whatever, you are going to really probably hammer your scores. You're going to say, I'm not resilient, I'm not a good person, blah, blah, blah. But a couple of weeks later, when you're in a better mood, is there a chance that actually your score is going to be different because your mood has changed? So reliability in questionnaires typically does not tend to be great. Validity also can be argued to not be great, but you need to be able to argue both sides. So when we're talking about validity, we're obviously talking about accuracy. Are questionnaires and interviews accurate? Well, people lie. People lie. People want to make themselves feel better, so they give a false answer. That being said, you could argue that there is value in subjective judgments from people because we can't see inside people's head about their happiness and motivation. People are their own best judge of character regarding how they're feeling. And so there is some value in subjective judgments. There's also ethical issues as well, which quite obvious. You can easily harm a participant psychologically by asking them a pretty traumatizing question. One thing I do tell my students quite a lot is my students wanted to do a study whereby they were going up to people who had just come out of traumatic relationships, and they wanted to ask these people trauma-inducing questions and time how quickly they cried. That's a bit unethical, as in that's very unethical. So ethics is a fairly major issue. And finally, sorry about the sniffles. Finally, the reason why this is important is that you may not know this yet, but at the end of your paper 2, you may have to design a self-report. It's 12 marks, 15 minutes, and from start to end, you may have to design a self-report and make a self-report about about anything they give you. So you have to be able to know. This one just down here, I think, is quite good. Write down 3 questions you would ask someone in a questionnaire. Ensure that those questions can only be interpreted in one way. That's a lot harder than it sounds. That is actually it for self-reports. I know I didn't go through the evaluations, but you do need to know them. When we're talking about self-reports, we're talking about questionnaires, interviews, and Likert scales, which are part of both. But you need to know those, the types. I guess finally, actually, sorry, before I finish, I did forget. Interviews can be split into structured and unstructured. I've not really gone through interviews here, to be honest. An unstructured interview is when you have no idea what questions you are going to ask them. You sit down and then you just start talking. It's unstructured. Structured interviews are where you have a set list of questions that are standardized, that you ask everybody, and you don't drift from those sets of questions. So again, you need to be able to know if to do structured or unstructured. I hope that was useful. It might be worth watching again, particularly pausing on the evaluations. But that is self-reports.